Hello, you've happened upon the 15th episode of Framed and Bound, a podcast in which book people talk about movies set in the literary world. My name's Tobias Carroll, and I'm the author of 5 books, including Political Sign and the recent novel In the Sight. This week I'm joined by Ian S. Maloney, author of the terrific novel South Brooklyn Exterminating, to discuss a movie that you might not think of when you think of movies about publishing, but which is totally in that category. 1997's The Game. The Game was directed by David Fincher and written by John Briccato and Michael Ferris. It stars Michael Douglas, Sean Penn, Deborah Kara Unger, Armin Mueller-Stahl, and James Rebhorn. Douglas plays the wealthy Nicholas Van Orton, who becomes enmeshed in a bizarre conspiracy when his brother, played by Penn, buys him a bespoke game as a birthday present. It's available to rent digitally from the usual places, and there's also a Criterion Collection edition available.
You know, I had seen The Game a while back, but I had completely forgotten that there was a publishing connection with this. And it was very interesting, I think, to rewatch this movie with that in mind, with that kind of in mind. The sort of investment banker character played by Michael Douglas is his company sort of implied owns a sort of storied New York publishing imprint,
Right.
assumably founded by a character played by Armin Mueller-Stahl, who, you know, kind of cornered the market in the 80s and 90s of playing sort of avuncular rich guys, often hiding a deep dark secret, and is kind of pushing out the founder to because it's not making enough money, and it's implied that the publishing founder had a had a warmer relationship with Michael Douglas's father, who we learned pretty early on had committed suicide when Michael Douglas's character was a kid. And yeah, it's interesting to watch the film through the lens of that. It's and there's I have some commentary about the way that publishing is depicted in this, but I will get to that later. But yeah, it was.
Yeah, when you were mentioning, possibilities, it somehow clicked how central this was to the plot of the story.
Yeah.
The fact that Anson Bear is kind of like he's the big journey. I mean, there are only 2 times that he seems to make his way out of San Francisco. Once to visit that publishing house, and then of course, the scenes later on, which I'm sure we'll discuss, in Mexico.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's just it's just such a curious film in the middle of David Fincher's work. I mean, that's why it was just an immediate for me, particularly because it comes between Seven and Fight Club, and I think for so many people, it's one of those films in his canon that people overlook or kind of like. And the publishing element is, it really boils down to, he's going to basically cut out this guy's family publishing industry over 10 cents on a stock or a quarter. So he's just, Douglas is like that perfectly ruthless investment banker character. This is just part of his portfolio.
Yeah.
I think Fincher does such a nice job of, like, in that small scene in the office, of humanizing the character, even through the facade of the friendship with the father. It's one of those central elements of the film I completely had not thought about, but it's right there.
It's very interesting to me that so a couple of episodes ago, Matthew Spector and I talked about Wolf, which was made at around, I think within a few years of this, and was also set in sort of a New York publishing thing. Although one of the things I think Matthew brought up is the fact that the interiors are an interesting mix of actual a New York publishing house and then a building in LA. But it's interesting there because, and I'm sorry to criticize Mike Nichols, but there's, watching that film, one of the things that really struck me is, like, this is supposed to be a fairly in Wolf, it's supposed to be a fairly general interest publisher, and it's clear that they if you look at the credits, they shot at the Tor Books offices, and they did not do anything to sort of, you know, camouflage the fact that like it is a science fiction and fantasy publisher. So it's like if you look closely at the books on the shelves, it's like, and you know, whereas I think one of the things that is, you know, David Fincher's penchant for details, you know, one of the things that comes up is like this location, the Bear Books offices, like is looks like very convincing, like to the extent that there is literally like a children's book imprint, like that we see the logo of, which looks like a viable children's book imprint, and like for literally one scene that, you know, as you point out, is like one of the handful of times the protagonist leaves California for a thing. And it's just, it's one of those things where, you know, yeah, I appreciated that aspect of David Fincher's just absurd levels of attention to detail, because it's like, yeah, this is this feels authentic for like literally the background, you know, in a way that like most films do not have that attention, and I quite appreciated that.
Yeah. I love that episode that you had about Wolf. That was a great episode with Matthew Spector, and
Yeah,
you're absolutely right. I mean, there's nothing left to chance in a Fincher film, and that's one of the fascinating things about like talking about him. And I'll be perfectly honest. One of the reasons why I gravitated, I was very lucky a few years ago. A friend of mine, this guy Mitch Levenberg, I love dearly, fellow writer. He had the chance to do like kind of do something out of the box and did a Hitchcock film in our department, and I was like, wow, that's great. I'd love to do something like that. So a few students were like, well, why don't you do something with film? And I was like, I racked my brain and I eventually wound up doing a David Fincher seminar.
mm,
And this was one of those films where, even students who are pretty well versed, they had totally skipped over. And it really always comes down to just his kind of maniacal attention to detail in every regard.
yeah,
The people love him, hate him for it. Actors hate him for it because of the 75 takes or whatever that they have to do. or, but I mean, so many of these, I mean, when you start looking at them, so many of them they have literary references. They're often movies about the making of movies. I mean, there's so much of that,
yeah.
you know. And
It's
it really is a kind of fact. I mean, there is so many different rabbit holes that you can go down when you start looking at a Fincher film.
it's interesting. I mean, this movie, that was one of the things that really struck me about watching this again, is like, because I think the first time I watched it, I guess to briefly do the plot summary thing, that the whole um premise of the film is that Michael Douglas's character is turning 40, is just about to turn 48 when the film opens, and turns 48, which is the same age his father was when his father died. And his sort of ne'er-do-well younger brother, played by Sean Penn, says, hey, I've purchased you this personalized experience. I can't really tell you about it, but it's life-changing. And and so much of the film is then, as his life starts to fall apart, it's not clear, how much of anyone who he meets is, are they in on it or not? Are they, are they, is this part of a game? Is the game actually a con, and he's, being set up to have all, his incredible amounts of wealth stolen? It's uh it's funny, like looking back on this again, knowing, uh and spoilers afoot for a 20 plus year old film, but it turns out the whole thing is in fact this the whole thing is in fact a game. He is not in fact, and when you watch it through that lens, it's also like, oh, this is literally, you know it would be very easy to imagine a version of this that is from the perspective of the people playing the game, and in that case it is literally like, it is about making a movie just tailored to this one guy's experience, where it's like they're using, how do we use guns that look incredibly realistic, and like, how do we rig things to explode, and how do we do this, and how do we do this, and it's like, oh, this is literally, this is literally that. So yeah.
Yeah. it's such a, like it's so curious how many, I mean, right, I mean, first off, the opening sequence, right? The Succession just completely just takes that. I mean, the HBO, that show just rips that, the movie making scene of the wealth and the kind of, but there's so many fascinating clues just right in the get-go. I mean, there's like a puppet show that goes on for like a quarter of a second. And
Yeah,
then there are clowns that are on show. And so there's all of this kind of class play about, this super duper wealthy person who's had everything handed to him. And ultimately, it's like the prince becoming the pauper. Like, he
yeah,
has to, the one gift you can't give him is to be able to take away everything. And that's
yeah,
that's generally what Sean Penn, his brother, Connie, the ne'er-do-well, gives to him, is for a while there, oh, it's all gone. And then he has to kind of, like, in a certain sense, has that kind of reawakening
yeah.
experience. That, of course, the hardest part about talking about the game, and of course, spoilers away. The problem, there's always the problem with the ending, and
Yeah,
you know, it's tough to get around that. It's a there was no, I think, easy way out. And I think even David Fincher thought, like, the third act in this film is kind of like they kind of lost something. They didn't know how to bring it home, particularly with the gala and the
yeah,
jump off the building, and all that. Um, but yeah, it's a it is, I think, it's an underrealized masterpiece in a certain way in Fincher's work, because
yeah,
it does play with all of these kind of paranoia, martyrdom. And he makes some great, I mean, there's some really awesome literary references throughout this film that he just kind of sprinkles in there, little chestnuts everywhere, you know.
can you talk a little more about that?
Sure. Yeah, like, I mean, the first, I mean, the one that really jumps to mind is, like, I mean, this book, I mean, this film really seems like it's a Christmas Carol. I mean, it's like kind of
Mm,
like a modern day technical version of, I'm gonna give you the one thing that you lack, right? And I'm gonna do so by kind of peering you, allowing you to see the, kind of kind of, fragile your existence may be, right? Um, so it's a character that has to kind of experience almost, becoming Bob Cratchit right before his very eyes.
yeah,
And, you got all the Wizard of Oz references. You have all of the Alice in Wonderland references. There's just these, and then the one that I wanted to kind of get your take on, which is, like, always
mm,
kind of got me a little, at the end with the gun is in a book. The book is To Kill a Mockingbird. It's kind of like an
mm,
odd look, but
yeah.
it's there. It's just, it's a curious way of kind of, like, it obviously is going to turn out to be a prop gun, but at the same time, it's in Harper Lee's novel, and hidden away in the kitchen of his house. So
Yeah.
curious.
Well, it is such, I mean, because that also seems obviously this is pre was it go go set a Watchman. Um but it's kind of it's interesting in the sense of, I mean, and maybe it's a little bit literal that, like, Atticus in that is such like the idealized father figure, and yet in this, you know, you kind of see, I mean, in the kind of home the flashbacks that are sort of styled like home movies, I mean, you get the sense of the father figure in this as much more distant, um which when you realize, like, oh, okay, this is clearly someone who is dealing with severe depression, it's like, okay, yeah, that would explain why, but it's all, I mean, and it's also interesting to me that, for it's sort of hinted that the Michael Douglas's character's marriage fell apart, because he was emotionally distant, which he kind of, you know there are, like, the handful of moments before the very end of the film where, like his conversation with his ex-wife is like one of the handful of times where he seems like a fallible human, where he's not doesn't just have the Michael Douglas master of the universe rich guy facade up, but he's actually, like, kind of starting to get at something. But it's also interesting that, like, that character is pregnant with the like a second child with her second husband, and it's sort of, again, kind of implicit that like, oh, like maybe, he didn't want to have kids because he feared, this similar thing, which it's not, and actually, and I will say, like, for a film that occasionally, there are some things about the screenplay of this that frustrated me a little bit, or the fact that like certain things were brought up and not really invoked, that never quite get kind of brought up again. Like that was a very like subtle, that was kind of a subtle moment that like it's not actually said, but it's like, it's just, if you're watching that, you can kind of tell like, oh, this is probably one of the reasons that like this marriage didn't work out, above and beyond just Michael Douglas being the sort of this very, I mean, his housekeeper is like the only person who he really has any kind of a, and that's someone who he is still paying them to be there.
And that, I mean, that opening scene too, when she's like, he's eating off the island on a tray, with his
Yeah,
tie, and it just leads you to that sense. There's that great, after the, when they begin the scenes of the home movies, he kind of has that splash of water on his face, and then you see him kind of go through this very cold mansion. You realize to a certain extent, this is a guy who's never left his parents' house, right? He has all this
yeah,
wealth, all this shelter. He's kind of just, he's never progressed beyond that, and that comes out so often. Even the conversations with the housekeeper, which are kind of perfunctory, and
yeah,
have a nice day, go about your work, you're in your lane, I'm in mine. um yeah, it's a very curious way of setting him up. And I think Michael Douglas was a great choice for the time. I mean, he comes off of
yeah,
the role as Gecko, and he's got the basic instinct, and he's a great character for this type of fall to happen
yeah,
to him, to a
yeah.
certain extent.
The casting, I was looking because the actress who played the housekeeper was Carol
Mm.
Baker,
Yep.
who had been in a bunch of like, who had done a lot of stage work, who had done, a lot of, I think was kind of sort of an early method person, which like, and also I had also missed that Linda Manns plays the Deborah Kara Unger character's
Yeah.
roommate,
Mhm.
which also just the casting in this seems to have maybe a little bit more than you usually see in David Fincher movies. Like, you're kind of getting a sense of like, oh, okay, David Fincher is clearly sort of tipping his hat towards people who he has, clearly seen in this. I will also just mentioning Linda Mans, there's the in the final act, one, I think perhaps one of the best scenes, just for the sheer uh sort of quotidian surrealism of it, is that scene where he crashes the cafeteria where all of the
Right.
people who have been in on it, and
Yeah.
like, there's everyone from like the guy living in a subway station who kind of gestures to him to pick up the phone, to like the roommate, to a bunch of cops, to the guy played by James Rebhorn, who is a sorely missed character actor who just um the other thing, actually, to talk about the I think one of another really nicely subtle thing about Michael Douglas's character, and I think it's again a very subtle sort of environmental storytelling thing, is like, for all that he is this absurdly wealthy character, it's very interesting that his choices of food are weirdly always very humble. It's like, when he's eating at home, it's like a burger or a sandwich, and like, there's the scene where he gets stranded in Mexico later in the film, and you see him like just
Right.
buying a taco at a roadside vendor and just tearing into it like it is the greatest thing he's ever had. And it's this very interesting thing that it's like, he's not someone who's like, I would like molecular gastronomy, I would like this. It's like, I want a burger and a taco. Like, I want
Yeah.
the most humble, reliable, stuff I can get. And like, and it's like the one, like, again, it's like those little things that, it's just like, oh yeah, like that taco looked really good. Like, it's like, yeah,
Like that
that
burger and
burger
the
looked
cupcake scene,
fantastic.
the tiny little cupcake, the birthday cupcake for one.
Yeah,
Yeah, I never thought about it, but yeah, you most of the time you see him really. I mean, from the birthday dinner, you never really, I don't think, in any of the restaurants see him eating. You get food spilled on him,
Yeah,
drinking iced tea. Everything is, but yeah, you're absolutely right. Everything kind of speaks to a kind of simplicity and a singularity in his
yeah,
character.
yeah,
And yeah, it's it's such a kind of like it's such an interesting play on if Fincher is such a kind of interesting control freak, there's almost like this topsy-turvy of like the guy who would go out and destroy the publishing house, take over the film, finally getting his comeuppance, right? And there's just like there's always these really curious kind of resonances between his films. There's obviously ties and authorship with Seven, with the also with you can't get around the Poe references to the burials
mhm,
alive that he kind of plays with at the end. Um, and that you're absolutely right about the canteen scene. It's kind of like a great like pull back the curtain scene, and basically everyone is sitting around at the cafeteria having like he's here.
yeah,
Yeah, I just it's such an and kind of the only lurking question I always have about it is, what does it ultimately say about this play between, reality and how much control, how much surveillance we have in the world. I mean, it's 1 year before the Truman Show, and so
mhm,
it's just like it seemed to be right in the era of the late '90s where everyone was thinking about these levels of like how much people have
yeah,
other these kind of global corporations have control of your lives and can kind of turn them on dime, and you know and to a certain extent it's exactly that little microcosmic world that he was pulling with the publishing house. I mean, he's going to
yeah,
take over for losing 10 cents on a dime and you know force him out, at the drop of a pen. But
yeah.
yeah, and eventually it all comes crashing down.
It's interesting to me watching this again that like at the very end the publish Bear is at the gala at the very end and actually seems to be, you know, I feel like in a different film he would just be like, you can we're gonna bring you back in, and in this case it's not. But it's interesting that character that is it's not just we're gonna give you back your publishing house, but like the guy's just like, it's okay, like kind of a there are more important things than work. Like his family seems to be kind of like, hey, it's cool, you can spend, you don't have to run a company anymore, you have plenty of money. And like it you talked about this in terms of Fincher's filmography, and it's interesting because at the time, I mean, this was like, he had made Alien 3,
Yeah.
and then did Seven, and like this in between Seven and Fight Club, which are two, I think, much more stylized movies. It felt like a little bit of a weird thing, and it
Yeah.
felt like a little bit more of an outlier. And now, I think this and like Panic Room and Mank all kind of seem to form a almost thematic trilogy about what wealth can and can't do. I mean, obviously the Social Network kind of fits in there, and even I recently watched The Killer,
Mm.
and it's interesting to kind of see The Killer, which is, I think, in a lot of ways David Fincher's funniest movie.
Mm.
And while I don't think of him as like a comedic director, there are a couple of hints of that in this too. Like and it's very underplayed, but there's a scene where the two brothers are both out for a drive and the tire blows out, and like neither one of them knows how to change a tire.
That's right. They just kind of give up.
Yeah. And like, yeah, Michael at some point, like Sean Penn sprints, runs away, and Michael Douglas has the tire jack and just like throws it
Yeah.
away in disgust. And it's like, and it's not underscored with like a, waka
Yeah.
waka waka, but
Yeah.
it's also it's hilarious that this like uber competent guy like does not is just like completely brought up short by this very simple task of changing a tire in a car,
Yeah.
because clearly he has always had someone who will change the tire for him, and like, you know just has never. It's like, it's been a while, knock on wood, but I have changed a tire. Like it was kind of a pain in the ass, but it wasn't it's a very simple task. Like, it is
Yeah.
designed to be pretty, it's like you have two tools. And just like the fact that he's just like, no, I can't do this, is I think very funny in a very understated way. And it feels that very much felt like a precursor to what Fincher was doing in The Killer, where it's much more of an overt, like, isn't this guy a badass, but also kind of an idiot? But we're not actually gonna like chew you in on, you thought you were watching a movie about a badass hitman who lives by a code, and you're actually watching like kind of a comedy about how absurd
Right.
the super rich are.
Yeah. I love that scene in that Killer when he's kind of like just the waiting around scene, like the endless waiting of him just sitting in that room and just like the tedium of it, talking to himself. It's And he works in those moments of levity, like that. You're absolutely right about that scene with Penn, because like he's like overstating the paranoia, like, you're in on it, that this tire blowout is them, and you're left in this whole film going, well, what's the outcome? Does he change? Like, I'm not, I there's a kind of cynicism throughout it where you're like, does anything at all? Because when Anson Bear he doesn't go back, there isn't a magical transformation. He's like, I'm good. Thanks for the invite. Glad to be here. And you're almost left saying, like, does the uber rich guy, like, all right, well, he chases after the girl at the end. Maybe they go, maybe or maybe not, they go have coffee at the airport, but maybe nothing happens. Maybe she's just like, hey, I'm off to my next gig, man. And, adios. It's kind of cynical about it. It almost feels like, hey, we're at the after party or the rap party. All right, everyone's going off. Peace. Is the transformation real or is it fake? I don't know. It's tough to.
I view it personally as like, I think I view the end with some cynicism, but in a slightly different way. Like, I mean, there is the very quick line that his brother says where he's like, you were becoming such an asshole, like I had to do this. So and I do think that at least the way that Michael Douglas plays him at the very end there, he does seem a little bit more like, okay, I can do this. And like, he has finally confronted this thing of like killing his brother, which is like one of the few people he genuinely cares about, and he has kind of had his worst fear that he would echo his father's death, and he's made it through it. But at the same time, I mean, I think the very bleak, for me, the very cynical thing comes with like this sense of like, yeah, the company that does the game, has figured out a way to make people's empathy work, but like, it is so absurdly expensive. Like it is so absurdly expensive that two very, very rich guys like look at the bill at the end and are like, oh my God, this is just like, and I think that's kind of the weirdly, that's like, for me, is like the very bleak sort of thing, that it's like, yeah, we can, there's a way to make you a better person, but like, it's going to
cost
be prohibitively expensive for anyone except for like, the most I mean,
I love that scene when they split it. I mean, when they split it, you're kind of like, all right, all right. Thank God you said that. It has a kind of like a nod and a wink to like, this kind of like hedonistic, game theory kind of play on life is really for the only the uber wealthy could ever afford to go through this. And the results are not magic anyway. I mean, there's a kind of sense of like, the wizard is the wizard. That's what that scene in the end when the guy who's taking the signed contract turns out to be the guy at the airport. And he's like this, you kind of have forgotten all about him. He's clearly, he's kind of the wizard, right? And he's kind of like just blended into the background. He pointed out the stain in his pocket and then he's gone. It kind of has that feel to it.
There's also, actually, I will say there's one other thing that I thought was again very kind of understated, but well, actually, okay, I'm going to say two things. One, I had to look up the family name is Van Orton, and I thought, to speak to the literary references, especially the way that certain characters pronounce it, it sounded a little like Van Wharton, and I was like, I wonder if that's, if that's an intentional hat tip, and I wouldn't surprise me if it was. but it also, the other thing, and again the very understated thing that surprised me a little, is the scene in which Michael Douglas goes to, get his physical and everything for the game, which turns out to also be part of the game. It's the woman sort of checking him in is black. I think several of the employees on staff are black. The James Rebhorn character is playing Dr. Feingold, who is a fairly Jewish coded last name. And it's interesting to me that this guy, who is, I mean, again, it's Michael Douglas in the 90s, which is like the waspiest, like the most uber wasp. It's like him not just kind of being bossed around would be a little unfair, but like is in a position where like not just he is encountering non wasps who aren't really there to put up with his bullshit. And it's pretty subtle. Like it's not in your face with it, but it's like I was watching it again. It's like, oh, this is like him a little bit outside of this very like avuncular, the club where he's working out and enjoying a glass of presumably very expensive whiskey with the guys who are whispering about the game, who also turn out to also be actually actors involved in the game. Yeah, it's like he's a little bit out, he kind of, I mean, I think part of it is he has to kind of wait online and have longer than expected medical tests and everything, but also it's just like he is also, it's not just it's sort of an exposure to the larger world of contemporary California, where it's like you're not you're it's not just rich wasps.
Well, there's a great scene I read it years ago. I remember reading something about there was a film critic talking about the scene where Feingold gives him the food, and when you look at it, the going around, the face that he makes is almost like you're handing me a pile of shit. Why? What are you doing? And it does have that feel of it. Like when you see the transformation, and this changes after the experiences. That scene, he's like holding it away from him, like, God, I can't believe I have to smell this.
Yeah.
But when he's tracking Feingold and has to go back to the Chinese restaurant, you see a guy kind of driven and on a mission and has purpose. And I think he does there's a nice change throughout the course of the film where, he goes from there's no way to sympathize with him. And I think that's where the script really changed. The original script, he was supposed to be kind of likable, but I think when Andrew Walker, what's his middle name?
Kevin Walker.
Kevin Walker comes in. He was the script doctor, and he was like, "No, we're gonna have to make him as unlikable as possible, because that's the point. Like, you don't want a guy that you're kind of like sympathizing with having to go through, like having to be buried alive and then go through drugging and all this kind of stuff in order to just make a point." But like the clothes are such perfect like indication. He's pristine. Everything is everything is monogrammed just right. And then you watch that transformation where he has to go and wear those baggy white clothes when he's dragged off to Mexico. Is like obviously 2 sizes too big. He's wiping his nose with a newspaper on a city street. He has no idea where he is. I mean, really emphasize, and his dark, pristine suits to the white, dirty clothes that he comes out of the grave in. Love that emphasis. It's where all of his kind of the method of the work kind of changes completely.
Yeah. Well, and also the way that the monogrammed shirts are used when there's the whole like stage, bacchanalia hotel room where it's like, well, who else could have been there? Like they've got these meticulously monogrammed shirts just like laying around the room, which the one thing that frustrated me about this a little bit was there were a couple of moments where like and maybe this is also, again, I would love to watch a version of this movie that's just what it like how the game is evolving to match what he's doing, and all of the people behind him were like, oh, we can't do this, let's do this instead, and like let's do this and let's do this and let's do this. um there's like, but there's the whole thing at the very beginning where they're like, oh yeah, you're gonna get, when someone gives you a key, like, it's
Right.
and reminded of the John Mulaney line that's like, I thought quicksand was going to be a bigger deal when I was an adult than it actually was. But it's like there's really only like two moments where he's given the key, and then there's like the misdirect with the keys in the glove compartment
Yep.
that's, that's obviously that turns out to have been completely staged. But you know and there's also the moment where he's given like an 800 number to call.
Right.
And while I understand that there's some setup of like some sense of like what is happening here, there's also a little bit of like, I kind of feel like in making the Nicholas Van Orton a very unlikable character, he does kind of seem like a guy who would be like, I would like to talk to your manager. um and I was a little, and it's one of those things that, like, I understand that you would want to give him that, but I also feel like it's almost like a Chekhov's gun not going off at the final act, where it's like, I would also have been fine if you just didn't, if that had not been there. But like, you know why doesn't he at some point try to call the 800 number?
Right. Repeatedly.
So
Yeah. There's a lot of different plot holes in it too. I mean, like, there's the other one, which is, besides, like some obvious ones, like he has the gun that he uses on the private eye. How on earth do you know that he shoots out a tire? He doesn't shoot the guy, right?
yeah,
So in her apartment when he's kind of confronting her, and it's a kind of cool scene that you kind of like you're on a movie set, it feels like, and the
yeah,
smoke is kind of rising. But at that point too, like the one thing that I kind of, in the reviewing is like, all right, you could say like, all right, this is a movie set. There are pops going off all over this stage apartment, but the car is also damaged too on their exit, and you're like,
yeah,
is it, there's that level of real guns in play, not real guns in play. How much of this, am I
yeah,
willing to suspend my disbelief? It's like one of the, it's really clever, but there are also times in it when you're just like, maybe it just takes it a bit too far.
did you, speaking of the apartment scene, did you also notice, am I misreading? It's like there seemed to be a lot of sort of Christian iconography in the
Oh,
apartment,
yes.
which
Yeah.
seemed like not necessarily a coincidence, but also seemed a little, I don't want to say off base, but like, I mean, it's like, I don't know if that's just like a, kind of a tipping, if that's there for his benefit, is that there for his benefit, just as like a, hey, it's a, you can be redeemed, or is it more of just a, trying to imply something about the Deborah Kara Unger character? That's, but it was something that again felt a little bit like, in the background, but it's clearly there.
Yeah, and
um
there's an odd thing where he takes the head of the Virgin Mary and puts it back on. Like
yeah,
that's like a very deliberate scene for that. Like and it's I mean the only thing I could think about in watching it was that, as he does that, he's about to go, he's about to flee with her, flee and then go off to his little cabin, and then eventually it kind of has that weird, like almost like odd quasi resurrection scene to it. You
yeah,
know, he puts the head back together. He's putting, in a way, he's kind of putting the pieces of the puzzle back together, and eventually it has that kind of, the kind of the over the top graveyard scene,
yeah,
very, Poe burial, whether you want to be, the premature burial, or if you want to talk about, any one of those ones, the fat 19th century fascination with, being buried alive. And then he comes, I mean, that scene is visually arresting. He comes out of that graveyard, that crypt, and there are fires and smoke and abandoned cars, and he's,
yeah,
he couldn't be much further from where we started off with him.
yeah,
But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a kind of curious moment that he does focus on quite a bit.
yeah,
Um, Oddly enough, and we're, of course, for the Christian iconographers, we're in the August 15th is the Assumption of Mary. So we got our our Catholic hagiography playing out as we talk. So
Yeah,
it's interesting. Yeah,
yeah.
interesting choices.
The what was the it's also it's I mean it, and the scene in Mexico also has the very, very symbolically loaded scene of him selling his father's watch given to him by his late mother, in order to get back into the States, which is, yeah, well, perhaps one of the most symbolically laden things. But although it's also interesting that, like, I feel like a weaker version of this film would also have maybe had a sequence where, like, he gets the watch back, and in this case it's more of just like, no, you kind of need to,
Yeah.
get beyond this is something you need to get beyond
Yeah.
in order to.
And the ambiguity of that word watch, like he's been kind of, from the start of that film, he's been under his father's watch repeatedly, right? Just
Yeah,
literally, even the scene, the club scene with Conrad, with Sean Penn, they're bandying about like, you basically assumed dad. You are dad, you've assumed his house, you assumed his role, you assumed his office. It's all you. And kind of that moment where he gives up the watch, and he has that, like, as you have done great work with road novels. There's that really poignant scene where he enters that diner and he's got like $17.85 or whatever it is, and you're like, oh man,
yeah,
like everyone just kind of like, oh geez, like turns their back on him.
yeah,
um yeah, he's kind of had to, like, you finally see a character who's realizing he has to kind of live life on his own terms and get rid of his father's watch, literally. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
um yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I'm gonna briefly wait. Where did I put it? I took notes on this, and I'm trying to see if I have anything else I wanted to bring up. Um, oh yeah, there was one moment where I have very, very few other things that I wanted to bring up, but I will say, there's the point where Sean Penn is having his, like, big freak out after he finds the keys,
Mm.
and again we sort of find out that this is not that he is sort of overplaying that. We're watching Sean Penn, who is a very good actor, play a character who is not quite as talented of an actor as
Right.
Sean Penn. But I
Yeah.
thought the very, like, over the top, very shouty version, I was just like, this is kind of hilarious that this sort of feels like Sean Penn anticipating, like, a Tim Robinson character. Uh
Yeah.
and I would totally watch a version of
Oh, absolutely.
the game where Tim Robinson is in the Sean Penn role, and just you know that
There's definitely, it's such an over that scene in particular, is he's freaking is so over the top.
yeah,
It's just like, even his facial expressions there are like, you know, um, yeah. But
yeah,
you needed some of those moments in there where you kind of have to laugh at the absurdity of this, and then, I guess the play too is like, uh, asking the question of, like, how many people can't escape their own games, right? They can't. That's
yeah,
the ultimate, is like, who knows where one game ends and the other one begins.
yeah,
Uh, but yeah, it's definitely a curious, it's a curious choice. It often feels like, a play on, the king who be. There's a great scene. I don't know if you picked it up in the cabin when he's bouncing around. He's been drugged and he's kind of going in and out. There's a great scene where he kind of topples the chessboard, right?
mm,
It's like just a curious little nod to the game is being turned upside down, and it just felt like so much of this could be like, you could boil it down to the king becomes the pawn, and
yeah,
that's like it's that role reversal that plays out throughout the course.
yeah,
um and it's like, it feels like, a Fincherian, like, this is the Christmas Carol, but without, we're bringing in, making, Bob Cratchit a partner. Everyone just kind of goes back to their world, and, life
yeah,
carries on. It's very
yeah.
cynical. Yeah.
It's also it's interesting. I mean, again, in terms of the, you know I I I find a lot of, like, Fincher is again an interesting director, I think, for a number of reasons, but thematically, like, this is kind of his first film to deal with the sort of corrosive effects of wealth. I will say that I think the one film of his I have not seen. No, this is not correct. I've not seen two of his films, and one of them is his adaptation of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. But I assume with that, I know that there are creepy rich people in that, so I'm guessing that would fit in there. Um, I mean, Mank is all about both the debilitating effects of extreme wealth and also the corruption that comes with just proximity to it. Um, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the only real wealth thing, you know, I don't know if Panic Room quite fits into that, but in Panic Room, it's also like,
Yeah, pretty much. She's like kind of wealthy. The husband is
yeah,
funding the house, and you
yeah,
know, yeah, there's definitely that kind of the wealthy exposure. And it, kind of the end of that film, they go right back to,
yeah.
they're still hanging out waiting for the next thing to go down.
And it's, I mean, and obviously, I mean, the ending of The Social Network, of kind of this like portrait of Mark Zuckerberg as this very lonely, kind of still searching for connection. I can't remember if it was David Fincher or Aaron Sorkin who had said that they wanted to do a sequel that would kind of that focused on Facebook's role in like political radicalization in the US. And it's especially interesting in light of this, because I think that could go to some genuinely interesting places.
Definitely.
And you um but also but also assumably that would, at least in the you know the cinematic universe version of Mark Zuckerberg, it would also kind of be a case of someone who, a very supremely wealthy person who has kind of a brush with, wait, is what I'm doing correct? And like, no, I'm actually going to double down on all of these things, and just kind of keep on doing the same thing I'm doing, which
Yeah. Someone
yeah,
once said that like, a lot of his films are like they're movies about movies, and
yeah,
movies about wanting to really, I think I think for a bit he felt that burn of Alien 3, that where he wasn't fully in control, and there's there was I mean there's certain things that are interesting in that film, but
yeah,
it definitely doesn't play as well, obviously, as well as Seven. Um, but yeah, there's just so much of this idea of not wanting. I have a great quote for you from him, but there's that sense of not wanting to be under someone else's thumb or on someone else's wealth. And there feels like there's often this punishment of like luxury or taking things for granted. Like, one of the reasons why I love David Fincher, I'll just tell you, one of the reasons why I got interested in his films at all. So I was with my girlfriend at the time in college watching Seven, and it was the only time I can ever remember that I was jaw dropped by the film reaction. So, we are sitting there and like we feel at the end of that film we just took a gut punch, and people jumped up like I'm talking about half the theater cheering, and I was like, oh shit, they were in a different movie than I was, and I'd
yeah,
never had that experience where the two of us looked at each other and were like, wow, God, they didn't watch the same film, because I just felt like, oh my God,
yeah,
you know, Hemingway Cole comes at the end, Somerset goes off, and you're like, oh, like wow. And there seems to be that level of like he takes some kind of pleasure in that sadism of taking these people off of high pedestals, and even when they have this like grand expertise of kind of throwing them really down to see what they can do.
yeah.
Let me give you one good quote. I got one of these. This is a quote that I had from years ago. This is from Fincher. I was always the kind of person who didn't like being victimized by other people's expertise. I think it's such a weird and
Oh
interesting quote,
man,
right? I was the type of person who never wanted to be victimized by other people's expertise. And in this film, the investment bank and marketer has no soul, and
yeah,
throws out his create anyone who gets in the way, and everyone is at his whimsy. Yeah, he just plows them all to the side.
yeah.
They become his victims.
It's,
Yeah,
I mean, it's especially interesting also in light of The Killer,
yeah.
because that is literally about someone using their expertise to literally murder people.
Really murder
um
people systematically.
it's, I have to say, I'm really glad that, and I would be curious although actually no, but I think it's very serendipitous for David Fincher that like this and Fight Club and Seven all came out before like the rise of spoiler culture, because
Yeah.
like I think I saw Seven a few weeks into its running time, and like the ending was still a huge shock to me. And like, and Fight Club, the twist in Fight Club was a shock to me, although it wasn't it wasn't a giant shock because I had read a novel that had a similar twist, and I think it's and I feel reasonably sure that either Chuck Palahniuk or David Fincher or both of them are probably familiar with the book in question. But it's still like I did not have to go like opening night to be spoiled, and like, hey, you're never gonna believe
Right.
unpacking that big twist in Fight Club. Like, wait, what's the big twist in Fight Club? Like,
I think my radar's up. Yeah.
yeah, like
Yeah,
you're
these films are really at a moment in time. You're absolutely right that like you didn't have that, like, like my son is big into film, and he's working and directing and things like that. And I mean, he almost has to close himself off. I mean, it's social media before you go see a film, and these films would have been like everywhere, like
yeah,
instantaneously. Where the twist, like, oh my God, Kevin Spacey in Seven, what? Like,
yeah,
or like, can you believe what that there's only one character in Fight,
yeah,
so you're absolutely right. Yeah, these hit at a moment of time where people could, reasonably go to the theater a couple weeks down the line, and you could avoid the papers,
yeah,
and just you'd be surprised by the twist. Yeah.
yeah. And it's interesting too that Fincher seems to have kind of moved away from doing, I mean, and some of that I think is probably just his natural progression, but it's also like, you know, it's not like, I'm trying to imagine like, there isn't really anything like that in The Social Network or in
Right.
Mank or whatever else. You know, um, I'm just I'm just trying to imagine like what the like you'll never guess the surprising twist at the end of Mank. Uh, but man, that would be
Like,
amazing.
yeah. Yeah, it's there definitely does seem to be I mean, he still has the fascination with the serial killer,
Yeah,
obviously the killer, Mindhunter, all that. But yeah, it's certainly, from the 90s, moving away from those I mean, I guess you still have it in Panic Room where you're desperately wanting to know. And there is a couple of great scenes in Panic Room,
oh
like,
yeah,
for example,
yeah,
like she knocked over that lamp, and like you're in that theater and you're like, is she going to make it? Is she not? And he does a really nice job building the suspense of that. But yeah, I mean, he seems to be moving away from those kind of like, big twists
yeah,
that come at the end. Yeah.
yeah,
Tough to keep the conceal now.
yeah. This is reminding me though, I have not watched Panic Room in a while, and I would really, I mean, it's like Jodie Foster and Forrest Whitaker and Kristen Stewart before she was Kristen Stewart,
Yeah.
and like Dwight Yoakam, and I think is Jared
Jared
Leto
Leto
the
is in it. Yeah, Jared
yeah,
Leto the ringleader of
yeah.
the
And like
yeah.
it's like that's like, yeah, it's like if you put those actors in a room together, like you're gonna get a good movie out of it. And
Yeah.
like I still love the way that like the geography of New York is used in the opening title sequence. I mean, also just, you know, clearly someone who has thought about, yeah, the look and feel of it.
Yeah.
Which, yeah,
He does it with San Francisco really well too. I mean, there's a really nice opening scenes, where he's driving in or when he's walking. There's also that great scene in the flip when he's driving into the office in the beginning, and then the end he comes off the ice cream truck, which is a nice little twist to childhood, and he's
yeah,
like walking down back to his office, kind of like, a totally different view. Yeah, he has kind of like interesting romanticisms with different locales that
yeah.
come. And
I
like
this
Seven is like no place. It feels like
Yeah.
you're nowhere, and
Yeah, I,
deliberate.
I remember watching Seven, and then there was a certain point where I was like, wait, they've never said where this city is. And like, and then, and I remember eagerly talking about it with friends who had seen it, where we were all trying to figure out, we're like, well, what's a city where there's that, but like if you drive north, it looks like that. And it's like,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Whereas this is also reminding me I really need to rewatch Zodiac one of these days for
Yeah.
which
My students, I got to say, that was one of the hidden gems. That was something that they didn't watch, and they were all kind of obsessed with it. And yeah, Zodiac, that Zodiac particular, that scene with the Gyllenhaal goes to visit the the, the guy who's keeping all the movie posters. I watched that a couple of months ago. It's
nice.
it tingles.
I've been watching. I am a fan of the show Evil, and which is now in its. I think it's like down to its last 4 episodes, and they've John Carroll Lynch shows up in it's kind of it's they've definitely like their casting director has kind of seems to have flexed a little bit for the final episodes, which includes John Carroll Lynch wearing a terrible toupee and like this like incredibly unflattering mustache, but it's also just like oh man, like again he's like just a character actor where it's like when you see him you're just like, oh, this is gonna something fun's about to happen, like I'm gonna this man is probably gonna scare the shit out of me. I can't wait.
I got to see that. I haven't seen that yet. What platform is that on?
Paramount Plus.
Paramount Plus. All right, I gotta check that out.
It's very it's I really enjoy it. I am bummed that it's ending, but I'm also like it's also four very good seasons are, you know, I can't really argue with that. And like I mean the first season is good, but it gets the first season I think was made for CBS, and then as it's aired on Paramount Plus, I mean it's meant that they could go a little bit bleaker places, but also the casting flexes. I mean, like Andrea Martin shows up in the second season, Wallace Shawn shows up somewhere in there, Richard Kind shows up in the last couple of episodes. So it's just like there's a lot of really really solid supporting actors, and like the core trio of characters is all have very good chemistry, and you know it's fun to just watch them sit in a room together and hang out. And it was also shot in New York, and it is so it's like you know you look at it and you're like, yeah, this is set in New York, and this is clearly New York City, which I also really appreciated for that.
Definitely.
So yeah.
Did you know that Jodie Foster was supposed to be Sean Penn's character in this?
Who was?
Jodie Foster.
Oh shit!
Can you imagine this movie with Jodie Foster as the sibling? I mean, I still I'm like she was slated to be in this in one way or the other, and it was supposed to be Connie, and then they had to rewrite the character. I can't imagine.
Man,
yeah,
that would have been, man, like
might have worked.
I mean, I think, and Penn is very good in this, but I think that would have been a really, I mean, just because it's like, I don't think I've ever seen Jodie Foster play like Jodie Foster as like debauched rich kid, like younger sister of like Master of the Universe type. Like, I think that would have been, man, that would have been really fun to watch.
Yeah, I think she would. Yeah, it would have been great.
Yeah. This is also reminding me I'm due for a rewatch of I'm a giant nerd for the movie Hotel Artemis, which is also just like it's just like watching Jodie Foster do also kind of a role I've not, you know, really seen her do, you know, before or since. And given that she's sort of at a point where, you know, you kind of get the impression she is not making a movie unless she wants to do the movie. It's also fun to see her. It's also just fun to watch her in that. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but it's like it was also the movie that was like sort of as proof of concept of like, oh yeah, Dave Bautista is actually very good at acting, because it's like most of his scenes in that are against Jodie Foster, and it's like, right, you are holding your own against like one of the most lauded, you know, screen presences of their time, and like, and you have a very fun rhythm going on where like you're both like, yeah, this is good.
Did you see her in True Detective yet? Did you see the last one?
No, I haven't seen. I've only seen the first season. And I mean, I understand the most recent one is a fairly, standalone sort of deal. But yeah, no, I haven't. I really need to.
Yeah,
Just,
please
yeah.
do. Yeah.
Nice. Did you have anything else about the film you wanted to bring up before we wrap
I'm
up?
really glad to be able to talk about it. I'm glad that it kind of popped into mind.
Yeah.
The publishing part really does it does play the role of getting him really exemplifying just what kind of disconnected character this is.
Yeah.
You really do get that sense. And there is that, you're absolutely right. Avuncular is the right word. He plays it really nicely.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was glad that it popped into mind because it gave me the excuse to go back to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And any projects of your own that you want to talk about before we
Yeah, so like a couple of months ago came out with my first novel, South Brooklyn Exterminating, which has been busy out promoting and very happy with it. So I'm just excited to keep going with that, and then trying to pick my way up into a couple of other projects. One with my sister, which is kind of like a artsy. She's a painter, and I'm a writer project. We're take on some family stuff, which this one, my first book is about my dad. This one's going to be a little bit more about my mom. And
nice.
then I'm more excited about I'm going into a detective series next. So that's
Oh,
my
sweet.
another. So
Nice.
look forward
Yeah,
to that.
I was gonna say, I don't think I realized until we did the event in Asbury Park, that your sister had done the cover art
Yeah.
which is really, it's a very nice bit of work. But
Yeah, she's great. She's just
nice.
a photorealist painter. Yeah, she does great stuff. So
That's awesome.
yeah.
And that brings us to the end of our discussion of The Game, a movie that's definitely one of the more underrated entries in the David Fincher filmography. In 2 weeks, we'll be talking about a very different film set in California about writers, publishers, and the absurdly wealthy. Bestseller starring Brian Dennehy and James Woods. David James Keaton will be my guest for that episode. As always, if you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a rating on your app of choice. Our email address is framedandboundpodcast@gmail.com, and our theme music is Arvid Franzen and Eric Berg's Life in the Woods of Finland via the Internet Archive. Thanks so much for listening.